Yeah, yeah.
So we just call them, like if,
So
they,
like
if we
in
put
the other
them in
one,
front,
but when we have time for Q&A, if we have time,
yeah.
then they come up. Yeah.
All right. You anyhow, you
Yeah.
handle that.
And I lost my papers.
No.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see if we can find that for you.
I must have worked.
Maybe after the coffee.
Alright, would you sit anywhere?
Yeah,
front
sit
here?
anywhere up front.
Okay,
I'm so
that's
excited to hear you.
Oh no,
And then I'll
don't
catch
get
up
too
with you
excited.
afterwards. Bog down in the
I don't know where they are.
Not bad.
Well, this has never ever happened to me.
All right. Let me go and have a quick scan outside. What is it?
It's typed out on A4. Typed out.
We'll find them.
Where they might. Yeah, just like where I left. Here. From my computer. But I had most important things I've written out. Why not send it?
Dust his nose. Yeah.
I know exactly where I put them down because last time I went up I didn't need my text, so I put them on the ground here. And somebody must have thrown them away. Well, on the floor here.
Maria, vill du stå här? Alltså, när folk vill och kommer in. Det ska vi göra. Her er planen. Du må gjerne få gjøre det hvis du vil. Vi skal gjøre 2 ting. Så vi skal bare si at vi Jeg kan si det, men du sier det mer etterpå.
I'll just get a reply. So I know exactly where that. It's so strange. Welcome back, everybody. Can you hear me? Is it working? Yes, now I hear an echo. It's working. Thanks so much. I'll just keep talking until you stop talking. So that's normally how it works. Okay, and it works quickly. First, just a kind of technical question. If somebody found a pile of notes here on the ground where I left them just before I went on stage, please bring them back to me, because if not, I'll keep working from my laptop. That also works. But if somebody put them away, please let me know. Before we start, I would first like to give the floor to the two of you to make a quick announcement. Thanks.
Thanks, Alexander. So, two quick announcements then. Firstly, just to say that we are launching today jointly, the UNDP and the Swedish EPA, guidance note on extracting good practices, which is a guide to government and partners on how to integrate environment and human rights in the governance of the mining sector. And this has been developed on request of countries, and in particular countries that we're partnering with under the EGP in a very participatory manner in cooperation and with government, civil society, human rights institutions, etc. And Maria, I think you wanted to make a few comments on the partnerships.
No, just to say that we could never do this alone, working with environment and human rights, and now today we're talking about conflict. So partnering up with, from the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency with UNDP has been absolutely key, and also working with Folke Bernadotte Academy and other partners. So it's really great. We have this report now, having also some more sort of concrete, what does it mean in practice? How do you operationalize human rights principles in the governance, environmental governance of mining? Really, really useful, I think, for the countries. But again, without partners, we would not have done this or be here today.
Yep. So it has great country examples, and we hope it's a very practical and useful guide for all of you, not only for governments, but civil society and development practitioners as well. We've brought hard copies of the executive summary version outside, so you're free to bring one with you when you leave. The longer version is online, and we'll share the link to that with you after we leave this room. There is also, I think, instructions on the table outside on how to download it. And lastly, we are going to launch an online course based on this guide in October, so stay tuned for that. And a second announcement. So you might have noticed that there is something going on to my left-hand side of the room. And yeah, so we have today here with us Therese Elnestam, who's a graphic recorder. And I think I will just leave it to her to explain just shortly what she's been doing here today and what she will be doing going forward. So Therese, do you want to come up here? Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Yes, my name is Therese, and I'm a graphic recorder and a graphic facilitator. Well, that means like I'm catching the value or the stars of your communication and transfer them into hand-drawn pictures, which will evolve during the day. And you're more than welcome to come to me in breaks and look at what's been drawn. And if you want, you can take a pen and do something with me, or you can just tell me if you want something that you're missing, and I will put it in the drawing. Yes. So that's very short about what I'm doing here today.
Thank you very much, Anne and Maria, for presenting the brochure. I look very much forward to reading it myself, so only a draft of it. And thank you very much, Therese. I've seen her work before at other conferences, and it's really amazing. So it's the best way to memorize what you've seen and heard today is just to follow her drawings. When we continue on integrated approaches and silo mentality, it's interesting to see what the literature says about working in silos. It says to break that down, it is good to have a common goal. And we already have a common goal because we agreed on the Agenda 2030. We agreed on the global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. But it also says that if you want to break down silos, you have to break down hierarchies, work on different levels, and work on networking between all players involved. And actually all of those things are things that come back in our talks today. So we need integrated approaches. And we need to break down silos between the themes like human rights and environment and conflict prevention. But we also need to break down silos between the institutions and within institutions. I'm coming from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs myself. We're constantly working on that to have, let's say, the Security Department work together with the Environment Department to together tackle challenges that you cannot deal with yourself only on your specialized, let's say, security knowledge or environmental knowledge. What we saw in the first session, I believe all of them were really inspiring examples on how to do it and what you can achieve if you break down the silos. My conclusion is, it works. It can be done. We have the right examples. We have the right expertise. We have it right here in the room. And all of these examples, you see that you get there by working together, by having an effective network, by sharing your knowledge and respecting each other's expertise. And in that spirit, I believe we should continue in this second session. And we will not only share here more successful examples like we did in the first one, but we will speak openly about the opportunities and the challenges that we are facing in bridging silos. It's very much a question now on how to do it. We understand now the need to do it. We understand that you can do it, but now we should focus further on how do you actually do that. So how can we be more innovative? How can we make use of innovation in other fields and use it for our own needs? How to use technology? How can you make better use of data collection, mapping tools, new techniques of sharing information? But also, how do you work with all stakeholders? How do you do that within government? How do you include business in your plans? How can business work with other stakeholders and with other themes to work on, like human rights and environment? All these things we want to talk about in this second session. So by building on this first session, we will just take a step further. Because once we know what works, and then it can be done, and once we know how it can be done, it is also important to scale and to accelerate and to expand these successful projects that you have. And for that, you need an acceptance, you need funding, you need donors that also support these plans, and you need support at government level and business level. So that includes very much that we explore, how we can provide better integrated support, because, if you believe in a responsibility to prevent, you should also believe in a responsibility to support prevention. And that's very much what this session is about. So in the very first panel that we have up, we have two speakers on data sharing and innovative technological partnerships, talking about the how to do it question that I just mentioned. And they have exciting examples of the use of data and technology. So I would like to ask, maybe you should already together come on stage, Inga Petersen, who works as Senior Extractive Advisor at UN Environment, and she will then immediately be followed by a presentation by Joanne Lebert, the Executive Director at Impact. So if you could both come up. Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Right, good morning, everyone. I am not Swedish. I work with UN Environment as a senior extractors advisor in the post-conflict disaster management branch in Geneva. And sorry, I'm doing the very dangerous thing of showing you a live demonstration of a technology platform, which if any one of you has done it, is never without challenges. So let's see. I think we're good. Right, so this is what we're talking about today. And in my short presentation, I'd actually like to make a case for greater environmental transparency in the extractive industries, as access to information can help build trust between stakeholders. It can help prevent conflict and ensure more sustainable development of natural resources. And some of the speakers have touched on this today already in the morning. Technology can help build bridges between stakeholders and help break down these silos that were mentioned. And I want to very briefly introduce you to a platform that we've developed at UN Environment called MapX. So for those of you working in the extractive industries, you're very familiar with the fact that over the past decade or so, much attention has been focused on increasing fiscal transparency in the extractive industries. The EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, for example, promotes the reporting of revenues paid and received by government and the private sector. And fiscal transparency is extremely important to make sure the extractive sector does deliver development dividends at the national level. But as we heard about this morning, the example from Peru, a lot of the conflicts that arise in the extractive sector are actually at the local level impacts, whether they're social or economic or environmental. So in Peru, many of the conflicts in the mining sector are about the impact on water, quantity and quality. We heard already about participatory monitoring as one of the means to address this. And that can play a key role in helping to prevent conflict because it gives ownership to the stakeholders and a sense of control. But to help overcome an us versus them rhetoric and really create multi-stakeholder partnerships, and we believe that an impartial third-party platform can play quite a critical role in transforming these participation into partnerships. Because when you have an impartial third-party platform, it can help aggregate data that's coming from the companies, from the communities, and from government, help consolidate differences, and really act as a platform for dialogue and exchange. So in this context, effectively using data, and especially geospatial data, so that can be located on a map, and the supporting information sharing technologies can be game-changing in this context. With geospatial data, you can show several data sets in a single view, like I have actually in the maps before here. You saw informal mining areas in Colombia together with a data set on conflict fatalities. You can also see patterns over time, temporal change over time, etc., visualize trends. What we find, though, is, and maybe some of you feel the same, spatial data can be quite difficult to access for non-experts and to analyze and visualize effectively. Yeah. So with this in mind, UN Environment, with support from the World Bank and also in partnership with UNDP, is developing MapX, which is an impartial platform to map and monitor natural resources and environmental risk using the best available data and digital technologies. And I'm using the platform right now to show you this. So this is a map of the human footprint. What's important about the platform is that leveraging the impartiality of the UN, we've complemented this by a data integrity assessment framework, which scores the data according to reliability, technical accessibility, openness, and sustainability. So the platform provides a global data store of reliable data, tools to analyze, contextualize, and visualize the data, alerts and dashboards for impact monitoring, which could be of use to some of you in your daily work, and a story mapping tool, which combines maps, narrative, visuals, which I'm using right now, actually. So we've pilot tested this platform across a range of different themes, from chemicals monitoring to biodiversity reporting, but I'll give you just a few impressions now from a use case in the extractive sector to give you an idea of the potential. So in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we actually work with the EITI Secretariat to help make their reporting data more accessible. So one of the things that we did is, first of all, to spatialize the data that's coming out of the EITI reports and create heat maps. So here you see the concessions, and the shading of the colors is the revenue payments that are coming out of these concessions. Once you've done that, you can contextualize this data. So here, for example, we've contextualized it with human development indicators, and here you see poverty rates. So if you have temporal data set, if you have data series over time, you can see, what is actually the correlation between mining sector contribution revenue payments and poverty rates over time, inequality, unemployment, etc. For UN Environment, obviously we want to look at this in the context of environmental risks and impacts. So here you see the same concessions overlaid with deforestation in the same area. We've also, in the DRC, used this project to help consolidate data sets from the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Mining. So here we've used our overlap analysis tool, and you see mining concessions that fall within protected area boundaries. And in this context, it actually led to a dialogue between the ministries to help consolidate these data sets. Very quickly, I spoke about dashboards that can be customized. So here, the resolution is not great, unfortunately, but we have a data point here of an artisanal gold mine in Eastern Congo. And we've customized this monitoring dashboard to help information management for the Minamata Convention on Mercury, which some of you might be familiar with. So we see some key indicators here that relate to the Minamata Convention, the so-called 4 worst practices, estimated annual gold production, mercury use, number of miners at the site, and also proportion of women and children at the site to help prioritize interventions for vulnerable populations. Another example from environmental monitoring is here a data point from Côte d'Ivoire, from Abidjan, where UN Environment did an assessment mission of the cleanup efforts of the Probo koala chemical contamination. And again, it's completely customized, the dashboards, to the sample values from soil, groundwater, etc. And we're currently talking to the government in Nigeria to support data sharing surrounding the cleanup effort of Ogoniland, to which the oil industry has committed $1 billion. But much of the funds are being held up because of a lack of transparency on how these funds are being spent and whether there is actually an impact on the ground. So I think I'll leave you with this. It gives you enough of an impression, and I really look forward to hearing from you whether you see practical applications of this in your own work, what are some of the challenges, etc. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll preface my intervention with saying that my PowerPoint presentation is very thin. I'm just trying to be as efficient as possible in the time allocated. And I am not doing a demo, but if those people here are interested in a demo afterwards, that can certainly be set up. So I would like to thank the UN agencies and the agencies of the Swedish government for this opportunity. After the initial scene setting this morning, I'm happy to share a concrete example of what I would call the evolution of an integrated approach, because we're constantly learning and constantly readapting, and I think this is important for this type of forum, and I hope we get to continue to feed as we continue to learn about integrated approaches on the ground. So Impact, formerly Partnership Africa-Canada, we changed our name last year, has existed for 31 years, and we focus on natural resource governance, primarily in areas of conflict, high risk, and where human rights are at risk. We really cut our teeth on the diamonds issue in West Africa in the late 1990s, which led to the formation of the Kimberley process, which we actually left in December because we were disillusioned with it after 17 years of trying to make it work. As you probably know, there's been a confluence of regulatory developments, legal developments in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere that have really put the focus on conflict minerals since the late 2000s, 2009, 2010 onwards, which has led to a great deal of interest on conflict minerals, responsible sourcing, private sector due diligence, etc. And a lot of these issues, and we're very much in that space with regards to gold, diamonds, tin, tungsten, coltan, now cobalt, lithium, et cetera, et cetera. So those initiatives and that focus is very much about provenance, so chain of custody, where the minerals come from and ensuring that they're clean, not linked to conflict, not linked to human rights violations. So one of the most difficult commodities to track is gold, and artisanal gold in particular. So what I'm speaking to here is not the large-scale mining that you've seen in previous photos. It's really mines like this, artisanal gold mines in Congo and other places where conflict and human rights are prevalent. So we decided to test a chain of custody system for artisanal gold right from the pit all the way to the retailer and the consumer. And I have a brochure here that explains how we did it, but we did manage to do it, and it's currently operational. And what's exciting about this, the project is called Just Gold. What's exciting is that not only do we have full traceability on the actual commodity, every gram of gold essentially that comes out of the ground and ends up in a consumer product, but also implementation of due diligence, so we know all the actors in the supply chain. We know whether they have linkages to armed groups, whether they're engaged in corruption, money laundering, et cetera, and that gives tools to actors, particularly private sector, but also government actors and civil society, so that they can identify risks and develop strategies to mitigate those risks. And just to give you a sense of how this is done, this is a very basic overview of what an artisanal gold supply chain looks like. And these are all the actors that we have to work with, from the pit through the supply chain all the way to the retailer, in addition to the governments to make sure that they're creating enabling environments, in addition to civil society who have to be monitoring implementation on a regular basis. And the photo at the far right are the rings that are produced with Just Gold, responsible gold from Congo, which is now being sold in the North American market. The company is called Fairtrade Jewelry Company in Toronto. So this is one layer of complexity. But Impact's mission is not so much about ensuring that supply chains are clean. It's really about ensuring that communities are empowered to decide how their natural resources are managed, to ensure that resources contribute to equitable peace and development and ultimately the SDGs. So we have a clean supply chain. We have actors in the mining sector who are formalized. We can say something is conflict-free or fair or equitable, but really what does it mean? I'm going to be a bit provocative and say, so what? I mean, the supply chain is clean and it's very isolated, but what does it mean for local actors? What does it mean for livelihoods? What does it mean for gender equality? Is it actually making a difference, and is it actually advancing the SDGs and security? So what we've done is, as an NGO, we've tried to go beyond the labels, beyond certification. So in addition to traceability, in addition to due diligence information, we've deepened our monitoring system to include impact monitoring. So we now have 725 data points in the project. So it monitors equitable livelihoods, women's economic empowerment, participation in the formal economy. It tracks peace and security incidents locally, regionally, nationally. Environmental issues, inclusive governance. So all those data points are now fed into the system as well. That means that the jewelry company at the far end now knows not only where how the commodity has traveled in its history, the actors in the supply chain, but they know, beyond a label, beyond fair this or fair that their engagement is having a positive impact or not on somebody's livelihood, whether or not their income has increased, whether the environment has improved or not, as a result, direct and indirect, of their engagement. So this is very much about evidence, and it's essentially where we're moving towards with regards to responsible sourcing, and is really necessary for us to make sure that we're accountable for the initiatives and the actions that we're taking together with the local community. In terms of technology, we've partnered with a tech company in Toronto called Consensus, and they've developed essentially a software platform onto which all of this information now sits. So adherents to the system, like the jewelry company and all the actors in the supply chain, can access this information. So now they have evidence of whether or not they're having an impact. They can tell a story about it. That's evidence-based. But also it provides value addition. So it's a way to encourage the private sector to do due diligence and to source responsibly, because they know and they can tell a story about whether or not it's having a positive impact. It's also commodity agnostic, meaning that it was developed from the bottom up. So the system is blockchain compatible, and that's a whole other discussion, and we have reservations about blockchain. But this is developed in the context of an artisanal mining community and is intended to fit and be adapted to that context in order to pull that context through and ensure that the local community has the power of say over their data and the power to know as well whether or not the intervention and the assistance is having a positive impact. It can be applied to rubber, cobalt. We're trying it for cobalt in DRC, diamonds, possibly water, climate change, adaptation, etc. So this is a new way, I think, where those of us who work in this space want to be assured that what we're doing actually has a positive impact. And I forgot to say, the information that's loaded into the platform, the monitoring and evaluation impact data, is uploaded every 6 months. So the research is done on those data points every 6 months. So it's real-time data, and we know what's happening locally, and we work with the communities to understand the power of that data. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you, two very impressive and inspiring presentations, and that seems to be technology that is going to help so much if we really want to integrate, make use of technology, all the data we need. These two examples are really wonderful and two very good presentations. I would like to give the floor to Ingunn Kroksnes, Senior Advisor at the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, to talk about lessons from the Oil for Development program. Thank you.
The reason behind the Oil for Development program is what we all know as the resource curse. So many oil-rich or resource-rich countries actually suffer from a number of issues, starting with
please do. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, did you hear what I just said before that? No? Yes, okay. So I just continue. Well, the resource curse, as we all know, it's starting with weak institutions that are not able to govern the sector, widespread corruption, the Dutch disease, lack of fiscal management and inflation, lack of value creation from the sector, pollution, environmental degradation, and last but not least, of course, social inequality, very often increasing social inequality, conflicts and human rights violations. Norway is actually one of the very few countries that has been able to avoid all of these. So that's the reason behind the program, that we were asked by the countries if you could share the Norwegian experience. So the Oil for Development program is all about sharing how Norway has managed the petroleum sector without falling into these pitfalls. And of course, it's not about exporting a Norwegian model. That cannot be done, so every country has to find their own way. But it's about sharing our experience. The ultimate, or the goal, not the ultimate, the goal of the Oil for Development program is the responsible management of petroleum resources. So responsible in a holistic way, not just the revenue management or the resource management, but also the environmental management. For that to be achieved, we believe that there are 3 basic preconditions, which are our operational goals, and that's where we work. First of all, we believe that the country needs to have a political and legal framework in place with all the relevant laws and regulations. So we assist in developing this legal framework, political and legal framework. Secondly, the authorities must have the required capacity to actually implement and manage those laws and regulations. So we assist in building capacity and institutional development. And last but not least, very importantly, we must have transparency and accountability. And this is, of course, all about the nexus or the link between an informed public debate and the responsible management of petroleum resources. So for an informed public debate to take place, of course, you need a certain amount of public space. But you also need authorities to make information available and accessible to the public. So in that third box, we work both with the authorities so that they actually make the information available, but we also work with civil society actors, NGOs, media, parliamentarians, so that they understand the petroleum sector and can ask the right questions. Yes, and of course these boxes do not work individually. I mean, they work individually, but at the same time, we have to work across the boxes to make sure that we get where we want to be in respect of responsible petroleum management. And last but not least, that's the ultimate goal of all Norwegian development aid, of course, is poverty reduction. So I think I would like to acknowledge that this is a very simplified model, that there are, of course, many other factors that influence whether or not petroleum resource management or the management of petroleum resources at the end will lead to poverty reduction. So we focus on those 3 sub-goals at the bottom where we actually do our work. Yes, the program has 4 components. These are 4 thematic areas in which we work. First of all, of course, is the resource management. Secondly, the revenue management. Third, environmental management. And last but not least, operational safety, avoiding accidents and occupational health issues. So we work in all these 4 areas, and the way we actually work is it's a governance program. So we work through institutional twinning from the Norwegian government agencies that are responsible for those sectors within the petroleum sector, working directly with their peers in the partner countries. So for instance, my colleagues from the Ministry of Energy and Petroleum work directly with the relevant ministry in Uganda, let's say. The same for the Ministry of Finance and their peers, Ministry of Climate and Environment and their peers. So we have ministry and directorate working directly with their peers. So it's a civil servant to civil servant program, working shoulder by shoulder. We don't transfer funds normally, we transfer knowledge. However, what we've learned is that these sectors should not be worked only within each and every sector. That's why we actually changed the name. Before we called them the 4 pillars of the program, and now we call them the 4 components of the program. It's very, very important that we actually work across these components and that they constitute a holistic whole of the management of petroleum resources. What we very often see in our host countries or government partner countries is that there is a very unequal distribution of power between those. For instance, the Ministry of Oil or the Ministry of Energy, they are very often much, much stronger. They have much more resources than the Ministry of Environment. So we have to make sure that they actually talk together. Very often they don't really know what the other hand is doing. They have very little arenas for cooperation. So that is what we are trying to facilitate, that we create arenas for dialogue, that we engage in cooperative processes with all those relevant authorities present. For instance, starting with the petroleum law, we make sure that they actually that there are actually provisions, environmental provisions, already in the petroleum law, which makes it much easier than for the environmental rules and regulations to be developed within the petroleum sector. Yes, this is what I wanted to say about the importance about working across those silos within the government. But of course, there are many other silos, the silos between the public and the private sector, the silo between the civil society and the public and the private sector, and so on. But these are the silos on which we work explicitly across in the Oil for Development program. Last but not least, I also want to say a little bit about our partnerships and dialogue that we have with others. Of course, managing the petroleum sector is a huge task, and one player cannot achieve it all alone. So we partner with the UN Environment Organization, for instance, We partner with the IMF, who has a petroleum sector program, the EITI, which is very, very important for our third sub-goal, the transparency and accountability, the Natural Resource Governance Institute, for instance, and many other research institutions, think tanks, national and international NGOs, and also other donors. So I think working together on these very, very comprehensive issues is something that cannot be strengthened enough. There is much more room to go, much more space to actually work together on these issues. And I think we are going to discuss that a little bit more in the dialogue session this afternoon or after the session. And of course, there are many more things I could say about the OI for Development program, but now I've actually exceeded my 8 minutes with 1 minute, so I'm going to stop here and leave all the questions and the dialogue for afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ingunn. And building on the last words that you said, I really believe that this is such a rich debate. If you just look at the speeches that we've heard this morning, what a completely different angles you can have when you want to break down the silos. So like this, you can do it within government, you can do it between different sections. We talk about different countries. So the next step we're doing now, because we haven't heard that voice yet, is the voice of business. So I would like to invite on stage Chris McComb, who will speak on water, human rights and mining. And he's from the International Council of Mining and Minerals. Please, Chris, take this one. I think still on.
Thanks very much, everybody. And look, I do appreciate the opportunity to come to speak to you all on this this important dialogue. Could I just do a quick check around the room? Do we have anyone here that works in the mining industry at all? Petroleum? With mining or for? With mining? Do we have anyone here from the private sector? Okay. I think my first point is probably going to be my last point in this presentation, and that is around breaking down those silos and how the corporate sector, certainly the private sector, can be a key partner and should be a key partner in these sorts of discussions because they're part of the solution. That's absolutely clear. Okay. I just thought I'd throw that one in there. So I'll just touch first on who we are. The International Council on Mining and Metals. We represent 27 members. Unfortunately, not all their badges are up there. We've recently acquired 2 other members. And they're responsible for more than 900 sites in over 50 countries across the globe. That's across a diverse range of geographies and a diverse range of commodities. We believe that principles, or mining with principles, ensures that the mining and metals industry can contribute to the Sustainable Development Agenda. It's very much a CEO-led organisation, and it's really about leadership through performance. A strong focus of our organisation is assisting the industry to really enhance and improve their social and environmental performance. And we work with a range of associations globally as well. It's going to be a little bit of a smorgasbord approach to this presentation. I'm going to touch on a few things. I'm hoping some of these issues will pique your interest and also resonate with some of the messages we've already heard today. Okay, so let's just go back to basics, and this is industry drivers. So what does industry need to grow? And what industry needs to grow is they need to manage their risks, and that comes from having certainty. What does that mean at an operational level, which is very much the focus of the intersection between responsible management of a mining operation, environmental management and human rights. And what that means at an operational level is a robust and stable legal framework, community trust and support. And I should say the reason we need both of those things is that the mining industry makes significant or extremely large investments. That capital investment takes many years to get a return, essentially. And given the long-term nature of that capital investment, we need to ensure that the environment will be stable for the next 10, 20, 30 years, so we can ensure that's a sound investment into the future. Accountability, transparency, and meaningful engagement with communities are critical to building trust and also mitigating the risk of future conflict. It isn't just a nice to have, it's going to come back and certainly affect your operation in the future if you don't address those community concerns and engage meaningfully with communities up front. And in the perfect world, that would be from exploration outwards. Lastly, effective management of resources. We need to accept that in industry's operations aren't removed. They don't operate in isolation to their surrounding environment, their regional context. We need access to a secure and steady supply of water for our future operations, just like all water users, for example. Therefore, an integrated regional management of resources will play an increasingly important role to the long-term viability of any given operation. With respect to what undermines confidence or increases risks, that's obviously regulatory, legal uncertainty, adversarial relationships of community conflict, in effect a failure of managing that community engagement, and behaviours that undermine the whole of industry reputation. As unfortunate as it is, often the industry does get its reputation, unfortunately, based on performance, the lowest common denominator. And lastly, our investors are looking very carefully at this issue. Certainly our investors are vigilant to our performance around socio-environmental issues and human rights increasingly. Hoping to move a bit quicker now. Okay, so the minerals and the SDG goals. We believe that the private sector can and should in fact play a role in promoting and supporting UN's SDG goals. Mining, where it's undertaken responsibly, is uniquely positioned to catalyse development and contribute to poverty reduction and the achievement of the UN SDGs. It's very much a huge investment, a huge shot in the arm for some of these economies, particularly developing economies. And often mining is the very first industry to take place in a region, bringing high-paying jobs, contributing to alleviating poverty. I mean, that comes, of course, that comes with its potential drawbacks if it isn't carefully and responsibly managed. There are specific issues associated with mining operations, both the characteristics of what we do, but also where we operate, that make this quite challenging at an operational level. And they include governance. Different governments have different capacities and also drivers, depending on where you operate. Environmental, clearly, we dig holes in the ground. Resources are often located in sensitive environments, so we need to be cognizant of that, all environmental matters. Social, we operate with a range of diverse communities with different cultural settings. Understanding, there's often a paucity of data, and I do reflect back on the previous presentation. I think data is absolutely critical to this, but not just data around environment, data around social aspects, data around cultural aspects. When you're going into a region, these are the things that impede taking a truly regional approach. And also intersectional issues. And that is, intersectional issues, for example, between environment and human rights, which is obviously a very keen topic today. Okay. So I'll now take it from the broader environment and focus on one specific element, and that is water, which has been a keen area of focus for us over the last few years. And I'm sure you'll agree it's a key intersectional issue for everyone, including our industry. Sorry if I keep holding that away. Obviously between environment, social goals, and increasingly human rights. ICMM members have committed to responsible water stewardship, which is essentially using water in ways that are socially equitable, environmentally sustainable, and economically beneficial. And it obviously involves collaboration with all our stakeholders. In 2017, ICMM members committed to a firm commitment around water stewardship. I won't go through the whole position statement, but I'll just touch on a couple of key aspects which are relevant to the discussion today. One, we need to look beyond the mine gate. In the past, mining operations have focused on compliance, managing water efficiently in the mine gate, within the mine boundary, and focusing on what they do well, which is mining and mining efficiently. It's very, very clear now that we need to start expanding our horizons around this. We are integrated into the catchments in which we operate. Therefore, we need to look at catchment risks and opportunities as they will affect us, as they affect other water users. And also setting context-relevant water targets. And collaboration is probably the other key aspect I'll draw out today before I skip to the next slide. And we've committed to proactive and inclusive engagement around this. Now I'll just touch on the business of implementation. Rather than me standing talking platitudes about the principles-based approach to mining, our members are actually out there learning as they go, but forging those partnerships. They're realising the benefit of those partnerships, working with communities to achieve outcomes which make good business sense, achieve their environmental requirements, but also realise those opportunities to enhance social outcomes, and of course it has a connection to human rights. I'll just touch on a couple of those now. So with significant sustained effort, companies are contributing to those outcomes. They are exploring the intersection of those issues, and an example which I'll put to you now is in Peru, Freeport-McMoran's Cerro Verdes site, and I excuse any South Americans here, is in a basin where the water is almost fully allocated. The company engaged with national and local government, the water utility, and civil society representatives to find a solution to ensuring future supply to the mine, but also mitigating the risks to local communities. The company developed a water treatment plant to deliver drinking water to 300,000 people in the community, but also to address their environmental risks or enhance their environmental performance. They're taking wastewater from that community, processing that now and using that as supply. Anglo-American in South Africa has built with South 32 has built the Imela, and excuse my pronunciation to those from South Africa, Imela municipality water treatment facility. They essentially collaborated with the local council effectively because a number of mines had an issue with respect to historical workings, contaminated water rising in those historical workings. They needed to meet an environmental objective, which was to treat that water. However, it's not good enough just to treat that water because clearly there's potentially a huge social benefit to using that water more positively. They engaged with local councils and now they've built essentially a potable water treatment facility, which is not a world first, but probably fairly close, which treats a huge amount of acid-affected water, turns it into potable water, and then on-supplies that to the community. And also empowering community through participation is a critical area that the industry focuses on, whether that be in Saskatchewan, Canada, the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, or the Gobi Desert. Certainly, industry has realised the benefits of working together and working with communities together. Okay, so whilst we've got some fantastic case studies, clearly it's not all roses and issues do remain. There are significant barriers to scaling up this approach, this collaborative approach. One of those barriers is clearly that mining and minerals exploitation is a temporary land use. How do you ensure we ended up with enduring value, enduring outcomes from a mining operation? Once again, maximising the benefit from that shot in the arm, which may only be 30, 40, 50 years long. Long-term sustainable outcomes can only be achieved through strong government engagement. Collaboration between companies is challenging because you're talking to your competitors, which makes it very, very difficult to share data. It makes it very, very difficult to share your objectives and contribute, although that is being done. We have to deal with ourselves as much as we manage our engagement with communities. Data, I mentioned data before. Data needs to underpin all our decision making, and there's a paucity of data in those regions, many regions in which we operate. Also, mining companies are technically focused and they may not have the capacity or skills to engage with communities on a social or human rights level or cultural. So that is something that some companies have the capacity, others have mixed capacity, but more support certainly is needed. And lastly, reflecting on human rights, the boundary between government and corporate responsibilities on human rights issues needs to be recognised. We can't be government because we're only there for a short period of time. That said, ICMM members are guided by the UN guiding principles on business and human rights in that vein. And lastly, I'll just go to key messages. Just touching on these very briefly, business has a significant stake in sound governance and the responsible management of natural resources. We are part of that community in which we operate. The private sector can and should play a role in promoting and supporting SDG goals. Mining undertaken responsibly is uniquely positioned to catalyse development and achieve SDG human rights outcomes. And the mining industry is committed to partnering with others, as difficult as that can be sometimes, to achieve sustainable and responsible management of natural resources. I've focused on water today, which is the area that I tend to focus on at the ICMM. And significant opportunity exists to leverage private sector investment to improve SDG outcomes. However, engagement by government and others will be critical. We can't do it by ourselves. And lastly, back to my first point, there's a strong need to engage with the private sector, including in these wonderfully constructive dialogues such as today. Thank you very much for your time. Sorry, I went a little too long, I think.
No, perfect. Thanks so much, Chris. And having worked for government for a long time, I can say it's just as well true the other way around, that you know, when you say as business you need government to get these things going, as government we say we can't do it without business. So it's good that when we talk about breaking down the silos, that we find each other here. We have 3 respondents to the speeches, and I would like to ask the first Florian Krampe to come up. Florian is a researcher at CIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. I'm glad we could drag you away, because I know that CIPRI has a big conference today as well on the Baltic. So it's a bit of a competition. So, but we got a good full room here. Thanks, Florian.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I'm Florian Krampe. I'm working at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, mostly on climate security, links to conflict, but also on the opportunities on the other side to conflict prevention and sustaining peace. It's very tough to comment on those 2 excellent presentations. I'll comment on the first 2. And I'll start with highlighting 3 points I especially liked, and I continue with focusing on 3 points where I think we need to move forward and need to develop our thinking a bit further. First of all, I really like the emphasis on the local level, actually in both, which is very difficult if you try to establish a global mapping tool. And to bring the local level in and have the local stakeholder involvement in both projects actually very central. And as part of that, the focus on bridging the knowledge gap that exists between local communities often that don't have the same access as a mining company will have is a really important element that that I really appreciate in both projects, because that's an important factor when we come to conflict sensitivity and developing these projects in a way that is sensitive to local context and doesn't do more harm than it does good. That said, I think there are 3 factors that I want to highlight that we need to look at in the future. One is complexity in politics. The second is climate change, and the last one is gender and marginalized communities. First of all, complexity in politics. There's a need, in addition to having these tools that show us and allow us to map various factors and overlay them, there's a need to additionally understand the local dynamics, because oftentimes they don't necessarily match. It's a platitude to bring out correlation doesn't mean causation, but of course there's a true story to that. And the knowledge gap in that factor actually matters, because not everyone looking at that map where we overlay conflict and mining communities or artisanal mines will draw the same conclusions, right? And we should take care of that. That's why these tools need guidance, and I appreciate that. I think MapX especially, and the other tool is especially working with local communities, but we need to increase the guidance that we have in this project in a way that is empowering and accounts for politics. The second factor is climate change and climate-related security risks, which are drastically changing the picture of that. That's not necessarily obvious in the mining sector, but of course, it changes the local level stressors, the local dynamics. And also, as Alex mentioned in the morning, our global strategies to deal with climate change are linked in various pathways to the mining sector. We need to account for those. We need to study maladaptation. If we're serious about conflict prevention, we need to look at these various dynamics. And that brings me to the next point, which is something that was missing pretty much, I think, in most presentations this morning, is the factor of gender and marginalized communities. Access and bridging and addressing, narrowing the knowledge gap is an important factor, but we need to also work on doing it in a way that inclusion becomes empowerment. And I especially like that element in your presentation, Joanne. I think that's something we need to, not just in those projects, but overall take much more account of. And I'm very happy Celia's session in the afternoon will hopefully more specifically highlight that element. And I strongly recommend you to attend that. Summing up, we need to move from addressing the symptoms to creating the synergies for sustaining peace. And to do that, we need to understand the complexities. We need to understand the new challenges that emerge through climate change, that emerge around gender and intersectionalities and marginalized communities. And we need the institutions to do that. And one of the problems is that our international system is not necessarily in a position to do that. Sometimes cooperation is not incentivized, right? How do we bridge those things? Most of the institutions we have developed or that are established today are not built and not designed to deal with the security challenges that we're facing today. Climate change being one of them, and we're working on actually assessing what different organizations are doing in relation to climate change. And we see this clear gap that these institutions struggle. 5 different departments in an institution will work on climate change, and nobody talks to each other. So I think we need to move into that direction, and we need to highlight those things, because collaboration is the only way to understanding and addressing the complexity of today. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Florian, for excellent remarks. We've worked together on many things. That's well, I could talk for half an hour on what was just raised, and then he would talk back half an hour. We're not going to do that now. I would like to ask on stage Mazaran Traoré. She's from International Alert in Mali. Hi, thank you.
Thank you. Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for welcoming me here this morning. I will react to Ingun's presentation on the Oil for Development program. And thank you very much for this well-detailed presentation. And especially, I was interested in the 4 components that you described, which I think is also echoing to the context of Mali. Especially in countries where the state is a shareholder for all mining companies. And as you all know here that Mali is Africa's 3rd largest gold producer. So it is very important for us to see how we can better manage our gold resources revenues. And also, I would like to stress here also that we need strong governance systems in place in order to achieve social and economic development, and also respect human rights for directly impacted communities. I think that the Oil for Development program model or system, I don't know how you call this, is much needed for Mali context, because we are facing weakness from our institutions. You've talked about that. You've talked about the corruption and the fact that we really need strong governance mechanism. And this is something that is really, really needed in countries like Mali in order to avoid the resource curse. I was discussing this morning with Celia on the fact that no later than yesterday, and even it's still going on because I'm receiving messages from Mali about an incident related to security in one of the gold production areas in West Mali, which happened because of frustration from communities related to a recruitment decision from one of our biggest gold production companies, which is Randgold, and you may know. So these situations are happening very recently because before we didn't experience violence in mining sectors, especially violence related to human rights violation. So I think based on what is happening in other African countries that are being supported by such sustainable development programs as Oil for Development, we need to also consider what are the key success factors that would work for specific countries. If I take the example of Mali, we are in front of, a strong government system, but also we need to consider the views of civil society organizations and local NGOs that most often work with international NGOs like International Alert for the case of Mali. But it would be also important to consider the link between the states and the local organizations, because what we are seeing now is that most of them may be working under the approach of blaming and shaming, but some of them are working on very constructive approaches, like the case of International Alert, because we work with, on both actors, we work with multinationals, because we insist that they implement the UNGPs. We conduct trainings at the local level, but also at the capital level in Bamako. But on the other side also, we work with local organizations, associations, and also working groups. This afternoon, I have a presentation on the support that we deliver to working groups in Mali in order to help them understand the legal and framework, the legal framework of the mining context in the country, and also how to ask for more rights from the mining companies, and also how to even accompany the states. Because if the government understands that it is important to give more share or more rights to the local communities, we can avoid situations like what is happening yesterday and today. So because things change, we have technology now and people hear about what is happening in other mining countries. So they are aspiring for more human rights, aspiring for more shares of the natural resources that are not lasting forever. So yes, I think this is a good example, and I would really want to continue the discussion after this session to see what are the lessons learned and how we can implement successful examples in other contexts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as last, thank you very much, Mazaran, for these comments. As last speaker, I would like to ask Tove Lexen, the Vice President of Push Sweden.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to comment on what Chris McComb said, and also making some general comments. I think it's very important what has been said about building partnerships and not only speaking about inclusion or participation, but also that that is something that everyone can have a say in, and that you also include those that aren't often included in these conversations. And also when you speak about mining and other industries, I think it's important that you also reflect on how that is putting maybe the agenda of the development of the country. If the industry needs to manage the water, needs to manage the land, needs to manage so many of the natural resources, you're actually managing the development of the country. And if I don't know if that's the role of the company, I think that is something that needs to be a more democratic process. So I think that it's really important to emphasize. And therefore, I also think that the business enterprises have a responsibility to include and build partnerships with the local communities when doing, for instance, mining explorations, and let the communities identify, do they want to have this development that the mining industry is causing, and also what is the benefit for them for if we have this industry development. And I think here it's also important to stress that benefits can be others than monetary. It can also be that you want to keep the nature the way it is, or that you have. I mean, I can bring an example from Sweden. We have it has been a very big controversy about an iron ore in northern Sweden called Gallok. That is actually the land of our indigenous people, the Sami people. And when opening a mine, that threatened their traditional way of living, where they have herding of reindeers. So those aspects also needs to be taken into account, not than just do we benefit on this like monetary, will we have more tax income or so on. And then I also think it's important when you have inclusion, or when you have these dialogues, for instance, where you try to listen to the local communities or the people affected. Like for one thing, it's important that those area or zones where you meet are unbiased, that you meet on unbiased land. But it's also important that their participants actually reflect the people that are impacted by the industry or the mine expansion. And here it's also important with other structural variables like language. What language do you speak? Is that a language that everyone feel comfortable with speaking? Is it also, can you provide support for attendance? Like if someone do not have the money to go to attend, can that person get support for that, or attend via Skype or something? And then I think it's also important to speak about substantial inclusion. So you make sure that there is an equality in knowledge level, that you also have a responsibility in the room, that all have a responsibility to let everyone talk. So it's not just those minorities that should try to get their voice heard all the time, but also that they are provided with the floor to speak. And also that we are having equality and impact in impact possibilities. And here I think it's also very important what we heard in the first session about from Colombia, how you included the local communities to actually measure the levels or the quality of the water and so on. I think that's something that could be done on other places as well. Yeah, I think that was what I wanted to say, and thank you again.
Okay, we do a Mentimeter now. Oops. Thank you very much, Tove, for your comments and all three commenters. I announced earlier that we would work on, we would use Mentimeter. By the way, the telephone is still here, so you can maybe bid on it and sell it to the highest bidder, but it's still around. We mentioned Mentimeter already, so get out your telephones in the last minutes we have before we go for a lunch break. And I have two questions. One is, what is needed to secure the right to a clean and healthy environment while preventing conflict? What are the first words that come up? Just type those words in. You can actually, each of you can type several words and then see what happens on the screen. I see institutions, that's what we need, and we need monitoring, local management, governance, now it goes too fast, good governance, equality. Keep them coming, and then we'll see if we see some kind of pattern developing. This is what you call a word cloud, for who hasn't worked with these. I see gender, we need data, we need good evidence, rule of law. We need whistleblowers, proper laws, we need skills. Seems that a few winners are popping up. Okay, I'll give you like 10 more seconds. Okay, so if I see what this is, it's always interesting what gets out of these things. So what we need to secure the right to a clean and healthy environment while preventing conflicts, basically what we're talking about now. Nobody says, by the way, integrated approaches, but that's what we're talking about, right? It should have been right big in the middle. Should have prepared for that a little bit, because that's of course what we're talking about. Okay, so accountability, inclusion, which came up in many talks already. Monitoring, yes, you have to monitor, to evaluate, to measure. You need good institutions. Transparency is a big one. It's interesting that the EITI was mentioned earlier, which is very much on transparency, but got sometimes this criticism that it doesn't work on all those other things in the days that I was working on it. Rule of law, empowerment, political will. This is interesting. So what we're going to do, at least I will take a shot out of this. I'm sure we'll keep it somewhere, but this is something that you might find back on Twitter. I'm always looking for more followers, so if anybody doesn't follow me yet, please do. And this is an interesting one for our debates later today in the when we move out in the working groups. I have one last question for you, and that is, what is the biggest obstacle when we want to replicate and accelerate and scale integrated approaches? Because you've heard this morning so many interesting examples, and of course the first thought that should come up, so wow, you know, if this works, why don't we do it everywhere? So what are the obstacles? Why don't we do that yet? Maybe we need more workshops here in the World Trade Center. That should be one. That's not one of the options. Okay, a tight race. This is a bit like election night, right? And you're looking at your party. Okay, well, it's a bit all of the above, but it's interesting that the winner is, and of course there could have been more answers here, but so it's a bit pre-cooked by just giving you 4 options, but a lack of understanding the need. That is interesting, and I think one of the just commenting myself on the first thing that comes up when I see this one coming out as the winner is that this is maybe a complicated issue to communicate about. You know, if you have, let's say, there's a disaster and you want to convince the people on the evening news that you should send money because people are drowning, that's like an easy relationship. When you talk about having successful but very complicated integration where you solve a lot of problems at once with a lot of different players, the communication might actually be a problem that everybody really understands the need and to know how to solve it. Difficult to measure progress could have been an interesting one, but most other people voted for lack of integration of budgets. I hope that in some of the working groups that will come back as well. From my own experience, having worked most of my life in government, I just know how terribly difficult it is if you want to work together on a program and you have to integrate those budgets. Often all kinds of rules, but also all kinds of psychological barriers block you from getting there. I got some bad examples that I can't give in public. And yeah, the communication, I touched on that one already. Looking at the clock, I'll take just a few more minutes for some last comments before we go into lunch and we go to the breakout. In summing up my views of this morning, I believe it was really inspiring, and we are here to talk about integration of human rights, of environmental sustainability, and of conflict prevention. And what we got was even more than that. I believe that we also are, what we are getting, what we're working on, what we already got is an integration of speakers with very different backgrounds and countries and studies and work experience. But they're all innovators. They're all looking for new creative ways to solve these kind of wicked problems that we are dealing with. And they all believe that, you know, when you do things different, you can just be more effective. And when you build bridges, you can be more effective. I actually believe, and I increasingly get more hope in a morning like this, that we can actually make this planet a better place. We've seen such good examples here. Mining and any other global challenge, actually, you need to work together, you need to be creative, you need to approach from all angles, you need to work with all stakeholders, and you need to realize that you have to focus on human rights, and you have to be inclusive in all kinds of vulnerable groups, and you have to be inclusive to the role of women and include the youth. That's why we asked the youth representative Tove to speak to you as well. And you need to focus on the environment if you want to protect human rights. And in doing so, the bonus that you get is that you actually get more, you work towards conflict prevention. So summing up, I believe that we can say that integrated approaches are essential to reach the 2030 agenda. It can be done. We've seen good examples. And I think it's fair to say that innovative partnerships are necessary to tackle these kind of multidimensional challenges that we're talking about. And we have to advance these integrated nexus approaches. as Tim said in his statement this morning, what he had on the screen, that if you want to walk fast, walk alone. But if you really want to walk far, and we have to walk far, and preferably fast as well, but you have to do it together. So investing in such approaches and partnerships, that is key if you really want to copy and to accelerate, and if you want to scale up these kind of successful projects. What you need is to convince the donors as well to invest in these kind of projects. In looking forward, I think we should continue to build on, further on developing this community of practice, as we already have seen building around programs like the Environmental Governance Program. And we should therefore come together again in a bigger group in springtime 2019 and take more time. But one of the things we missed here in the plenary is time for discussion, but we will catch up in the afternoon, of course, and in the informal time that we will have. But there's so much more room for rich debate and getting deeper into this. And then we should also broaden the approach and look at all natural resources, and look at human rights and environmental sustainability and conflict prevention, and be inclusive. Maybe it would be a good idea to end, when we come together again in springtime, with a Stockholm Declaration on inclusive approaches for natural resources, while keeping in mind the human rights and the environment and the conflict prevention, and to be inclusive. So and that's not something that when we are back here in springtime that we should just draw up at that moment. That is, there should be a process leading up to such a kind of declaration. And I think that will be an exciting journey to make together, and to broaden that group and to get deeper into these issues. We have lunch now. When we come back, session 1 will be in the New York room. Session 2 will be in the Washington room. Session 3 in Sydney. And session 4 in Paris. Does everybody know what session 1, 2, 3, and 4 are? If not, I just remind you for a second, but you will have gotten all that information. So parallel session 1 is how can participatory environmental monitoring committees empower citizens to shape decision making. That's what we will do in this room. Then session 2 is on assessing the rule of law and environmental governance. Session 3 is strengthening women's participation in natural resource governance and conflict prevention. And session 4, investing in meaningful participation of youth in environmental governance to sustain peace. So we have now the lunch break, and we will be back here. You should be back in your room, either here or the other rooms, at 1:45. So we have exactly 1 hour to get there. Okay, good luck.
Hello. The lunch will be served in a restaurant that's in the floor below this one. You gotta go right after you pass the E sign.